destructive. Deep Dive Podcast Show. Let's dive in.
It's becoming really clear, isn't it? Muslim communities are a significant and, well, growing part of Western societies.
Absolutely. You really do see it everywhere.
Yeah, from like local neighborhoods right up to the national stage, politically speaking.
Mm.
So today we're taking a deep dive into exactly that, but focusing on the UK. We're looking at representation, the laws, the policies that affect Muslims there, and, the cultural discussions that always seem to follow.
Exactly. And we've pulled together a pretty comprehensive report for this. It uses government data, news reports, academic research, trying to get a really clear picture of how things are evolving in the UK.
Right.
Our goal, really, is to pull out the key insights for you, the listener, so you can get a handle on Muslim integration in Britain, understand the legal stuff, the policies.
Without getting totally bogged down in detail.
Precisely. And also
Right.
see how the UK stacks up against, other Western countries.
Okay. And you mentioned something striking just before we started about Parliament.
Yeah, just as a hook to get us started. Think about this. Back in 1997, there was just one single Muslim MP in the UK Parliament.
One. Wow.
Just one. Fast forward to 2024. That number's jumped to 25.
25.
Oh.
That's a huge leap. Okay, let's unpack that. What's behind such a big increase?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? It's not just about demographics changing, though that's part of it, of course.
Sure.
It also signals, I think, a growing political awareness, maybe engagement within Muslim communities themselves, and, political parties trying harder to connect with diverse groups of voters.
Makes sense.
And the report breaks it down. Of those 25 MPs elected in 2024, most, about 18, are Labour. But you also see conservatives represented and a few independents, too.
And these aren't just abstract numbers, obviously. These are actual people shaping laws, representing constituents.
Yes, exactly.
The report mentions names, right? People like Rushanar Ali, Naz Shah for Labour.
Mm-hmm. And Nusrat Ghani for the Conservatives.
Yeah.
Representing areas all over, from London right up to Yorkshire.
And even though he's in Scotland, not Westminster, you got Humza Yousaf becoming First Minister. That felt like a big moment, too.
A very significant milestone, yes. And it connects to this broader trend we're seeing. It's not just happening at the national level either.
Okay, so where else? Local government.
Yeah, the report points to a really strong presence there, too. Over 500 local councillors who are Muslim across the UK.
500. Wow.
And a big chunk of those, maybe 3/4, are Labour affiliated. Just looking at the 2022 local elections in England, something like 443 Muslim councillors won seats.
And when we think local leadership, mayors often come up. The report talks about them.
It does. It makes a distinction, though. A lot of mayoral roles are ceremonial, kind of symbolic.
Right.
Places like Oldham, Luton, they currently have Muslim ceremonial mayors. The estimate is somewhere between maybe 30 and 85 such roles nationwide.
But then you have London.
Ah, yes, London. Sadiq Khan, that's the big one, isn't it?
Because his role isn't just ceremonial.
Exactly. Mayor of London is an executive role. Real power, big budget, lots of influence. His election back in 2016, that was huge. First Muslim mayor of a major Western capital city. It's just a different scale of leadership.
So we're seeing this representation in elected office, both national and local. What about other parts of the system, like the House of Lords or the civil service itself?
Good question. Yes, it's reflected there too. In the Lords, the report suggests around 19 peers are Muslim. Figures like Baroness Saida Warsi, you might know her name, or Baron Nazir Ahmed.
Okay.
And the civil service, the people actually running government departments day to day, in 2023, about 3.5% were Muslim.
Which sounds small, maybe, but in numbers.
It's over 18,000 people out of roughly 520,000 total civil servants. And what's interesting is that percentage is ticking upwards. It was 3.3% the year before. And if you factor in people who didn't state their religion, the actual figure might be closer to maybe 4.9%.
And we should probably remember some of the firsts along the way, too, shouldn't we? Like Sajidi Javid.
Yes, first Muslim Home Secretary, that was 2018.
And before him.
Shahid Malik, first
Yeah.
Muslim minister back in 2007.
Right.
So, yeah, all these appointments, plus the growing numbers in parliament, in councils, in the civil service, it really paints a picture of, well, multi-level participation by British Muslims in how the country is run.
Okay, so that's the representation side, a clear upward trend. Now let's switch gears a bit. What about the actual legal and policy landscape? Does it sort of reflect and accommodate Muslim communities in the UK?
This is where things get really interesting and maybe quite complex too. But broadly speaking, yes, the UK has put in place a framework of laws and policies that offer significant protections and accommodations.
Like what, for example?
Well, the big one is the Equality Act 2010. That's fundamental. It bans discrimination based on religion or belief in loads of areas: work, education, accessing services.
And specific laws against hate speech. I know that's a big concern.
Yes. The Racial and Religious Hatred Act 2006. That made it a crime to deliberately stir up hatred against people because of their religion.
So that applies directly to, say, Islamophobic hate speech.
Absolutely. It can be prosecuted. And the Crown Prosecution Service, the CPS, they also recognize anti-Muslim offenses specifically as religious hate crimes, which can mean tougher sentences if a crime was motivated by Islamophobia.
Okay, so legal safeguards are there. What about more sort of proactive accommodations, things that actively support religious practice?
Right. There are several key areas here. First, diet. Halal food.
Okay.
The UK allows religious slaughter for both halal and kosher meat. And crucially, it gives an exemption from the usual rule that animals have to be stunned before slaughter.
Right. I know that's often debated, the stunning issue.
It is usually around animal welfare concerns, but the law recognizes these religious requirements. Though, interestingly, the report notes that in reality, something like 80% of halal meat produced in the UK is actually pre-stunned anyway.
Huh. That's a nuance I wasn't aware of. It shows how law and practice can differ.
Exactly.
What about something really visible like Islamic dress? Hijabs, niqabs?
Yeah, this is a major point of contrast with some other European countries, especially France.
Right.
In the UK, there's no ban on wearing Islamic clothing like the hijab or the niqab in public places or in government buildings.
So you can wear a headscarf to school or to work in a council office?
Generally, yes. In fact, some institutions like police forces or certain schools, they actually offer official hijab options as part of their uniform.
Really?
Yeah. The guiding principle seems to be respecting religious dress as a personal freedom. The main caveat is usually around security, needing to see someone's face in specific high-security situations, like at border control.
Okay. Another big area must be faith schools.
Absolutely. The UK system supports faith-based education, and that includes Muslim schools.
How many are there?
There are nearly 30 state-funded Muslim schools in England and Wales, plus over 150 private Islamic schools.
And when did state funding start for Muslim schools?
The first one opened back in 1998. These schools, they have to follow the national curriculum like any other state school, but they also incorporate Islamic religious education.
Yeah, what about regular state schools? Do they make accommodations?
Many do, yes. Things like offering halal meal options, providing prayer spaces or quiet rooms, especially during Ramadan. It varies from school to school, of course.
Marriage and family law? That sounds like an area where religion and secular law could really intersect in complex ways.
It definitely is. Okay, so polygamy. If you try to perform a polygamous marriage in the UK, that's illegal, full stop.
Right.
However, the UK has historically recognized polygamous marriages that were legally performed overseas, but only for very specific, limited things, mainly some old social security benefits, and even that's being phased out now with universal credit.
Okay. What about just having a religious wedding ceremony, like a nikah, without a civil registration?
That's allowed. You can have a religious-only ceremony. But there's a lot of ongoing debate about this, particularly concerning the legal rights of women in these unregistered Islamic marriages, especially if the marriage breaks down. They might not have the same protections as in a civilly registered marriage.
I can see that. And what's the deal with Sharia councils? You hear about them sometimes.
Right. The report estimates there were about 85 of these operating informally in the UK by 2024. Now, it's really crucial to understand what they are and what they aren't.
Okay.
They operate completely outside the formal UK legal system. They have no legal power. Their role is basically voluntary mediation, mostly for family or marital disputes for people who choose to go to them.
So their rulings aren't legally binding.
Not at all. And crucially, any advice or outcome they suggest cannot contradict English law. If it does, it has no standing. They are controversial, no doubt, but their existence kind of reflects the UK's slightly more flexible approach sometimes to letting communities handle certain disputes internally, as long as it stays within the bounds of UK law.
That's interesting. The report also mentioned immigration and asylum policy. How does that fit in?
Yeah, it's an important point. The UK's immigration laws themselves are secular. They're not based on religion.
Okay.
But because of major international crises in recent decades, the UK's humanitarian responses have, in effect, disproportionately benefited Muslims fleeing conflict zones.
You mean like refugees from Syria?
Exactly. The Syrian Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme that ran from 2014 to 2020 resettled about 20,000 refugees, and the vast majority were Syrian Muslims.
And Afghanistan more recently.
Yes, the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme launched in 2021. The aim was up to 20,000, but by mid-2024, various related schemes had actually brought around 29,000 Afghans to safety. Again, overwhelmingly Muslim.
So it's important to frame this correctly. These aren't laws designed to favor Muslims.
No, not at all. They're humanitarian responses to specific crises that just happen to occur in Muslim-majority countries. That's the key distinction.
Got it. And beyond these big legal and policy areas, are there other, maybe smaller, day-to-day cultural accommodations being made?
Oh, definitely. Lots of examples in public institutions. Things like allowing breaks for fasting during Ramadan, trying to reschedule exams if they clash heavily with Eid where possible,
Okay.
granting religious leave for Eid festivals, providing halal meals and Muslim chaplaincy services in places like prisons and hospitals. These often stem from broader equality guidelines and human rights principles about accommodating religious practice reasonably.
Right. So it really sounds like the UK has developed a pretty extensive framework, laws, policies, practices that in many different ways does accommodate Muslim communities. Let's turn now to funding. Are there specific government initiatives or funding streams aimed at supporting these communities?
Right. And this is where you see some concrete financial investment. One really significant area is security for places of worship.
For mosques, you mean?
Exactly. Mosques, Islamic centers. Given the unfortunate rise in reported anti-Muslim incidents, the Home Office has really ramped up funding for security measures, things like CCTV, fencing, alarms.
How much are we talking about?
Well, in 2024, a big package was announced, $117 million over 4 years. And that was alongside a similar package for Jewish institutions, reflecting concerns about anti-Semitism, too.
Okay.
But just looking at the grants specifically for mosques, the report highlights a really sharp increase. Back in 2016-17, it was only about £73,000.
Wow. Tiny.
Tiny. But in the year up to April 2023, it was nearly £3 million.
That is a huge jump. What's driving that, do you think? Just the rise in incidents?
That's certainly a major factor. It likely reflects a growing government acknowledgement of the threat from anti-Muslim hate crime and feeling a need to demonstrate a commitment to protecting these communities.
Makes sense.
It's generally welcomed, of course, by Muslim organizations, although it's worth noting the demand for these security funds often exceeds what's available, especially after, certain international events happen that can sadly trigger backlash.
Right. Okay, so security is one area. What about broader things?
Right.
Like promoting integration, community development?
Yeah, there's funding there too. The government launched something called the Integrated Community Strategy back in 2019. It had a $50 million fee fund attached.
And what did that fund do?
It focused on specific pilot areas, places with diverse populations, often including large Muslim communities, Bradford, Blackburn, Birmingham, those kinds of places.
Right.
And the money went towards things like English language classes, programs to empower women, youth employment schemes, basically trying to tackle segregation and disadvantage.
Any other funds like that?
There was also the Controlling Migration Fund, about $100 million in England, some of which supported projects helping immigrant communities, including Muslims, with things like access to housing and school places. And looking forward, the report mentions a new grant fund specifically called Combating Hate Against Muslims that's supposed to open in 2025.
We talked about education before with faith schools. Is there other funding in the education sphere supporting Muslim communities?
Yes, definitely. Beyond the state funding for the actual Muslim faith schools and the religious education that happens in all schools, you get grants from other bodies like the National Lottery Community Fund or local councils. They often fund things like Muslim youth clubs or those supplementary schools, sometimes called madrasas, that offer religious instruction outside of regular school hours. Also, interfaith projects trying to build bridges.
And this adds up.
Over time, yeah. It's hard to put a single figure on it, but collectively it represents millions of pounds going into supporting positive inclusion and educational activities within Muslim communities.
Okay. Now, the report also touches on the PREVENT program. That's often controversial, isn't it?
Yeah.
How does that fit into this picture of funding and support?
It is controversial, and it's a much more, let's say, nuanced area. Prevent is part of the government's counterterrorism strategy, right?
Not contest.
Exactly. And it does allocate funding to programs. Many of these programs work closely with Muslim communities with the stated aim of steering individuals away from extremism. And some Muslim community organizations do actually receive Prevent grants to run specific projects, but it's also viewed with a lot of skepticism, sometimes outright opposition, by significant parts of Muslim civil society.
Why is that?
Concerns about it potentially stigmatizing communities, worries about discriminatory targeting, questions about whether it's actually effective or if it damages trust with authorities. So while taxpayer money is directed towards activities within Muslim communities via Prevent,
whether you'd call it support is kind of debatable.
Exactly. The perception of it varies hugely. It's seen by some as necessary security work, and by others as counterproductive or harmful.
Okay, so pulling that funding thread together, it seems like UK public spending related to Muslim communities is quite varied. You've got protection like mosque security, you've got empowerment and integration initiatives, and then you've got these security-focused counter-extremism programs like Prevent.
That's a good summary. It's definitely a multifaceted approach, trying to foster inclusion, provide protection, address security concerns, all at the same time. Though, as we've said, the effectiveness and how these efforts are received is definitely still up for debate.
Right. So now, to get a better sense of the UK's approach, let's broaden out. How does this compare to what's happening in some other Western countries? Are they dealing with similar issues around their Muslim populations?
Oh, absolutely. And looking comparatively really helps highlight what's distinctive about the UK situation.
Okay, where should we start? France seems like an obvious point of contrast.
Definitely. France operates under this very strong, very specific principle called laïcité.
Strict secularism, basically.
Yeah, a very strict separation of church and state, or religion and state. And this underpins a lot of their policies, like the 2004 law banning conspicuous religious symbols in public schools. That directly hit Muslim girls wearing headscarves.
I remember that causing a huge stir.
It did. And then in 2010, they brought in a ban on wearing full-face veils, the niqab or burqa, in all public spaces, not just schools or government buildings, but streets, parks, everywhere. There's even a fine if you break that law.
Wow.
And more recently, they've had laws aimed at countering what they call Islamist separatism. So yeah, very different philosophy and approach compared to the UK's general acceptance of religious dress in public.
Okay, a very stark contrast. What about Germany? They took in a lot of refugees recently, many Muslim.
They did. Germany's approach is maybe more about controlled integration. They welcomed over 1 million refugees, mostly from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, from 2015 onwards. And that led to massive integration efforts, but also, inevitably, some social tensions. Policy-wise, they brought in a partial ban on face veils for public servants, like civil servants, judges, soldiers, in 2017. And some German states also have rules stopping teachers wearing headscarves in schools.
So not a full public ban like France, but restrictions in certain roles.
Exactly. Chancellor Merkel herself said the full veil wasn't appropriate in Germany. And this period definitely saw a political backlash. You had the rise of the AfD party, which is strongly anti-Islam, and movements like Pegida holding anti-immigrant rallies. So even though Germany has strong constitutional protection for religious freedom, the sheer scale of recent immigration, plus some high-profile crimes involving migrants, really fueled these culture wars. Though, like the UK, they are also investing in integration programs and have increased funding for mosque security recently.
Okay, let's hop across the Atlantic, the United States.
The U.S. is different again. Constitutionally, strong protections for religious freedom, no nationwide bans on Islamic dress or anything like that. Discrimination is illegal.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Well, the post-9/11 context is crucial. That led to various security policies, and then, more recently and controversially, the Trump administration's 2017 travel ban.
Right, targeting several Muslim-majority countries.
Yes, Iran, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, and others. It faced huge legal fights, was initially upheld by the Supreme Court, but later rescinded by the Biden administration.
What about those anti-Sharia laws you sometimes hear about in the U.S.?
Yes, that's been a trend at the state level. Over 20 states have considered them, and maybe about 13 or so have actually enacted some version.
And what do they actually do?
Legally, often not much. They're largely symbolic. They typically forbid state courts from considering foreign or religious law if it violates public policy, which U.S. courts wouldn't do anyway under existing legal principles.
So why pass them?
Critics argue they're primarily about stoking fear and Islamophobia, making a political statement rather than addressing a real legal problem. Their impact is debated, but they certainly contribute to the political noise.
But on the other hand, you also see increasing Muslim representation in U.S. politics.
Yes, definitely. Figures like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib becoming the first Muslim women elected to Congress in 2018 was a big landmark. But challenges remain, things like vandalism against mosques, local opposition when communities try to build Islamic centers. Those issues are still very present.
Okay. How about Canada? Often seen as very multicultural, very welcoming.
Generally, yes. Canada has strong protections for religious freedom in its Charter of Rights and Freedoms and a national policy of multiculturalism. But there's a major exception: Quebec.
Ah, Quebec.
Yeah.
Always different.
Right. Quebec has adopted a much more French-style secularism. Bill 21, passed in 2019, is the key thing here.
What does Bill 21 do?
It bans public sector workers in positions of authority that includes teachers, police officers, prosecutors, judges from wearing religious symbols while on duty.
So that directly affects Muslim women wearing hijabs, who are teachers, for example.
Exactly. It's had a huge impact and been incredibly controversial. Quebec actually used the notwithstanding clause, a constitutional mechanism to shield the law from immediate challenges under the charter, even though courts have acknowledged it violates religious freedom. Appeals are ongoing.
So a real tension there between provincial policy and broader Canadian values.
Absolutely. It contrasts sharply with the rest of Canada. Ontario, for instance, accommodates religious attire and even publicly funds Catholic schools, which is unique. And Canada overall has welcomed many Muslim refugees and has Muslims in high office, like Ahmed Hussein, a former refugee who became Minister of Immigration, or the first Muslim appointed to the Supreme Court. So those tensions seem quite regionally focused in Quebec.
And just quickly, what about other parts of Western Europe? Are we seeing similar patterns?
It's a mixed bag, but similar debates are happening everywhere. Countries like Belgium, Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands, they've all followed France to some extent and implemented bans on full-face veils in public. Switzerland even had a referendum in 2021 to approve such a ban. And after some terror incidents, countries like Austria and Germany, too, have brought in laws restricting foreign funding for mosques or increasing state oversight of Islamic organizations.
So more state control.
A trend towards that in some places, yes. But then you have countries like Sweden, alongside the UK, which have generally resisted bans on religious clothing, preferring dialogue and integration efforts. EU law provides a baseline against hate speech and discrimination. But beyond that, integration policies really vary massively from country to country. It often comes down to each nation's history, its particular concept of national identity, you know?
Yeah, France's strict laicite versus the UK's more sort of accommodationist tradition. It's a real spectrum.
It really is. And one thing you see across the board is that accusations of Islamophobia often spike after major global events, sadly. Governments are constantly walking this tightrope, trying to address genuine security fears without unfairly scapegoating entire communities.
But at the same time, you mentioned this counter-trend.
Yeah, despite the tensions, you see growing civic and political engagement from Muslim communities themselves in nearly all these countries. People getting involved, challenging stereotypes, becoming part of the mainstream conversation. It's very much an ongoing, dynamic process, finding that balance between religious pluralism and social cohesion.
Okay. So to try and wrap this up for you, our listener, we've really covered a lot of ground. We saw the significant and frankly growing representation of Muslims in UK government, MPs, councillors, lords, civil service.
Right. A clear upward trend.
Then we looked at the UK's legal and policy framework. Pretty comprehensive, lots of laws and accommodations for Islamic practices, diet, dress, education, even things like Sharia councils, albeit informally. But we also noted the complexities, the ongoing debates around some of these.
Absolutely. It's not always straightforward.
And finally, we zoomed out, looked at other Western nations, saw a real variety of approaches, didn't we? From France's strict secularism to Germany's controlled integration, the U.S. mix of constitutional protection and state-level friction, Canada's Quebec exception. It highlights just how differently countries are handling these questions.
It really does. Which leads us, I suppose, to a final thought for you to take away and maybe mull over.
Okay.
Considering all these different models we've touched on, the different ways countries are trying to manage integration, secularism, religious diversity, what do you think are the long-term implications? For social cohesion, yes, but also for how we accommodate diverse religious identities in the future.
It's that balancing act again, isn't it?
Exactly. Finding the right balance between individual freedoms, allowing people to express their religious beliefs, and maintaining those shared societal values that kind of hold a diverse, multicultural society together. There probably isn't one easy answer, is there?
In the heart of this nation, under skies so blue, there's a spirit that's stirring, values strong and true. From the mountains to the prairies, from the cities to the sea,